My name is Busi Dlamini, and I'll be facilitating the day today. And we thought it would just be good to initially just frame a little bit of the conversation. So both myself and Khalil will do just an intro before we allow our speakers to speak. So I think for today, just in terms of framing the dialogue, right? So if we're looking at the Stop the Bantustan Bills, there's something for me that's important around having space to think through some of the challenges we're facing as South Africans. And an opportunity for people that are both practitioners, but also people that are influencing both policy and legislation in South Africa to be in conversation together, but also for us that are not necessarily engaging with those issues to also have input and have an understanding of those things. I think part of what's challenging in civil society is the inability to cross-pollinate ideas, right? So hopefully part of this dialogue today is an opportunity to have more of an in-depth understanding in terms of the Bantustan Bills, and in what ways we might be able to both influence and shape what needs to happen following the dialogue as well. So I'd like to call on Khalil, who's just going to welcome us, and we'll take it from there.
Welcome to the Nelson Mandela Foundation. My name is Khalil Goga, and I am the Director of Dialogue at the NMF. It is my pleasure to host you all here today. I know we have veterans of the struggle, members of civil society, activists, people from the state, the media, and many from the grassroots, from rural areas, and academics who have joined here today. And we have people from across the country, not only from Johannesburg, but from a number of provinces in South Africa whose voices we'll hear today. The NMF has undertaken dialogue work into land for the past few years. We have tried to offer a space for dialogue on some of the most critical issues, such as changing of Section 25 of the Constitution, traditional leadership, and the release of land by white landowners. What we have realized is that it's always an emotive issue. Like most South Africans, we believe that a thoughtful, deliberative, and engaged land reform is integral to sustainability, justice, and the reduction of inequality in South Africa. It is part of the unfinished legacy of Nelson Mandela. But we also share concerns that a failure to place the needs of those who live in rural areas is disfavored below politicking and a jostling for power. Public, private, and traditional fiefdoms are being created and reinforced. This can result in the eroding of both the democratic and socio-economic rights of our rural poor. In our work, we have realized how often the views of rural people are left out of the debate. And as people are often reduced to be patronized and fetishized by others. Instead of strengthening the rights of our most vulnerable, we are fast creating a dual system of governance and systems that place some above others. You know, since being involved in understanding this debate and in dialogue, you know, one of the most striking things when traveling to rural areas is that South Africa is one of the few places where when you buy a piece of land, you almost inherit the people. I mean, that's absurd. It's a completely absurd thing that I find very difficult to shake, and it shows, you know, what actually is happening in South Africa. So with this in mind, we partnered with LARC and ARD, and thanks to the support of the Hans Seidel Foundation, we were able to host today's event, and we have 3 goals in mind. Firstly, we want to highlight the impacts of the bills to a larger audience. Rather than taking it directly from an academic viewpoint, we have purposely gathered a number of voices who are directly impacted in rural areas. The bills will have outsized impact on people whose voices you'll hear today. Secondly, we want to sharpen the current discussions around the bills. The bills are long, complex, contested, and have been part of the political debate for the better part of a decade now. Our aim is to create that space to sharpen these discussions and begin developing shared visions of the future. Finally, we want to create a level of media attention to the discussions. These dialogues are not always as intriguing or as salacious as the palace politics of the public protector and the president, nor does it elicit the polarizing mentions of changing Section 25, but it is critical. It affects the lives of 18 million South Africans. Moreover, when we speak of the land question, there are very few mentions or interviews with rural people. So many people have an opinion of how land reform should look like, but very few people actually talk about the multiple and multifaceted views of so many rural communities and people. We have to narrow this gap and we have to create these platforms. The NMF will always be an open space for South Africans to have this conversation, and it is part of our ongoing work on land. We hope that most of you will support and assist us in this journey, and that together we can deepen rural democracy in new ways. Thank you all once more, and I'll hand back to you.
My task this morning is to lay some of the groundwork for our conversation. And so what I'm going to do is I am going to speak briefly as I can, about how it is that these laws all fit together, right? And so when we talk about the Bantustan Bills, we're talking in the main about 3 pieces of legislation, but those pieces of legislation click into an existing network and framework of existing laws that have a particular historical narrative. And so in part what I'm trying to do this morning is to tell a little bit of that historical narrative so that we're able to contextualize the impact of the laws within this wider historical conversation. So to begin with, I'm going to very briefly explain some of the abbreviations because I'm going to use a lot of them and I'm going to move quite rapidly. So references to the BAA of 1951 are references to the Bantu Authorities Act of 1951, right? The TLGFA is an abbreviation for the Traditional Leadership and Governance Framework Act. That is really sort of in many senses the mothership, right? It's the piece of legislation that anchors much of the conversation. References to the CLRA are references to the Communal Land Rights Bill, the Communal Land Rights Act of 2004. It's important to note that this is obviously no longer existing legislation as it was struck down by the Constitutional Court. References to the TCB are speaking about the Traditional Courts Bill of 2017, which is currently on its way through Parliament, so it's about to go into the National Council of Provinces. And references to the TKLB are references to the Traditional Leadership and Khoisan Leadership Bill, which is currently before the President, awaiting his signature. So what I want to do is just begin to kind of build this historical narrative. And for the most part, these bills find their heritage in the Bantu Authorities Act of 1951, right? The Bantu Authorities Act sort of anchors the start of where I'm going to begin this conversation. Of course, it's important to remember that it would have been preceded by a ream of other acts that were passed both in the colonial administration but also throughout the apartheid administration. So it would have been preceded by the 1913 Land Act, which, as we know, has a particular role that it played in shaping South Africa's land history. It would also have been preceded by the 1927 Black Administration Act, which again, as we know, has a particular role. But I'm going to start with the 1951 Bantu Authorities Act only because it consolidates some of the work done by its predecessors in the sense of the 1913 Act and the 1927. I'm then going to move to the Traditional Leadership and Governance Framework Act of 2003, which is the existing piece of legislation. What I want to illustrate is the ways in which the TLGFA carries across some of the historical legacies that existed and were entrenched by the Bantu Authorities Act. I'm then going to explain the relationship between the now defunct CLRA and the TCB in relation to the Traditional Leadership and Governance Framework Act. And then along the way, I'll speak about the Traditional Khoisan Leadership Bill as well. Right? So I moved then to 2 images. The first is an illustration of the former homelands, right? And the reason why I'm putting these up is because the depiction of these boundaries is one that I want you to carry in your mind as I continue with my input. These are the boundaries that were consolidated and established through that historical narrative, right? They would have been initially set up by the 1913 Land Act, further entrenched by the 1936 Land Act, consolidated by the 1951 Bantu Authorities Act, right? And remember that this was all through a process of forced removal, of imposed identity, and a process that was highly contested and strongly opposed by the communities who were subjected to it, many of whom are actually in in this room today. Right? And so really what I'm trying to illustrate is that even though we speak about a post-democratic South Africa, or democratic South Africa, post-1994, the rural areas in particular are haunted by the legacy that's left by these boundaries. And to illustrate that, I put up a map of something that's referred to as traditional councils. Traditional councils, as I'll explain, are structures that are set up by the 2003 Traditional Leadership and Governance Framework Act, and that makes them structures that are technically constitutionally compliant, right? So they are structures that are allowed and recognized as having legitimacy in our current democracy. Of course, what's really key to pick up is the way in which those traditional councils overlay exactly with the former homelands, right? So again, there, what I'm pointing to is this continuing legacy, this continuing narrative that is fundamentally shaped by the boundaries, which I'm about to speak about now. Okay, so the boundaries that were in the images that I just put up find their root in the the Bantu Administration Act, right? Authorities Act of 1951. And the Authorities Act really was about this idea of consolidating people into these perceived homogenous tribes, right? So this idea that black people lived in neat groupings where they all lived according to languages spoken and practiced the same culture. Now, the way in which the apartheid administration made this myth a reality was to force people to live in accordance with these conceived ideas, right, and these conceived identities. And so the way that that was done was through the preceding laws that I've spoken about, so the 1913 Land Act, but it was really consolidated by the 1951 Bantu Authorities Act. And what that did is it did two things that I want to reference. The first is that it broke down the natural relationship of accountability that existed between communities and their traditional authorities. And Nelson Mandela and his peers, Governor Mbeki and Albert Lutuli, were very critical of this, right? Governor Mbeki described it as a breaking down of the old give and take that existed between a leader and his community, and these Bantu authorities would rely on the fact that they were backed by the state's might, right? So they were appointed by the state, making them accountable to the state, making them supported by the state, and breaking down the relationship of needing to rely on authority and legitimacy coming from the people over whom they held authority. The second thing that the BAA of 1951 did is that it carved out these boundaries. And as I said, these are boundaries that were highly contested and that were strongly opposed. It forced people to live in ways that were not natural to how they had been living, which was in far more diverse groupings. And so in some parts of the country, it resulted in very highly divisive and very violent forced removals to force people to live in these neat tribes, right? Some of which I put up on the Homelands map. So the relationship between the Bantu Authorities Act and the Traditional and Leadership Governance Framework Act of 2003 is that in the Traditional Leadership and Governance Framework Act, there is a section called Section 28, and Section 28 is the deeming provision, right? And what it does is that it carries across those same boundaries, because the wording that's used in the Framework Act is that it deems traditional leaders, it deems tribes, and it deems those tribal authorities that existed under the Bantu Authorities Act to be traditional councils, traditional leaders, and traditional communities of the here and now. Right? So it doesn't dissolve any of those structures. It doesn't do anything to ostensibly address the contestation of those particular boundaries. It allows them to be carried as they are from the 1951 Act into the 2003 Act. And so what you see then under the Framework Act is the continuation of this contested historical narrative, right? Now, the idea was that there would be two mechanisms that would be used to balance this deeming provision. And the two mechanisms were that your traditional councils of the current democracy, which were your tribal authorities of old, would have to undergo elections, right? So 40% of a traditional council is required by law to be elected. 60% of a traditional council is appointed by a traditional leader. The second safety mechanism that would be about legitimizing these structures in democracy is that there would be a commission. And the role of the commission, which was brought to life by the Framework Act, would be to investigate traditional leadership disputes and would be to begin to try and unravel some of this deeply contested history. Now, there are many people in the room who can speak with far more authority than I can to the manner in which both of those safety mechanisms has not held up. right? There are many people who speak to how traditional councils have not held said elections. They have also not, as is required by law, adopted 1/3 of the membership must be female. There are traditional councils that have not abided by those requirements. The commissions that have led investigations into the traditional leadership positions in order to try and unravel some of this contested history have really struggled to A, resolve some of these disputes, but B, many of the rulings and findings of those commissions are contested in court. And so there are deep questions around how well those safety mechanisms have actually managed to make legitimate these traditional councils, thereby making it slightly less problematic that they carried across the same identities from the 1951 Act. Coming then to the CLRA and to the TCB. The thing that the Framework Act does, and this is really the thing to note, is that it assigns to traditional leaders and traditional councils roles and functions, right? So it provides in Section 20 of the Act that national and provincial government can make, through law, a role for traditional leaders and for traditional councils in a variety of areas. And in Section 20, there is a list of areas in which traditional leaders and traditional councils can be given a role. One of those areas was land administration, and that's how you ended up with the Communal Land Rights Act. So the Communal Land Rights Act was the law that would give a role and function to traditional leaders and traditional councils in terms of land administration within the former homeland areas. Another ground in that list that's in Section 20 is the administration of justice, and that's how you end up with the Traditional Courts Bill. The Traditional Courts Bill is the law that would give a role and a function to traditional leaders and traditional councils in the administration of justice. The list is quite long. It includes things like the registration of births and deaths. I think it has something about sports and recreation. It's quite a fair list. But these are the two laws that one has been tried to be passed and the other is in the process of being passed, that are designed to actually assign powers. Because what the Framework Act does is it does not on its own give powers to traditional leaders. It provides the framework for their recognition and it provides the framework under which they would operate, but there need to be additional pieces of legislation that ascribe actual power and actual roles and functions to those particular traditional leaders. The interesting thing is that in spite of the fact that none of these laws have actually held up, A, to constitutional scrutiny, and B, very few of them have managed to make it all the way through the parliamentary process, you will find, and you will hear today, recounts about how traditional leaders are operating as if they already have the powers. So they're operating as if they are already enabled to do so by law. And it's important to note that as of currently, there is no law that empowers traditional leaders to operate as they do when it comes to land administration, and there is currently no law that allows traditional leaders to operate as they do when it comes to traditional courts. So the last thing that I'm going to do is speak very briefly about the Traditional and Khoisan Leadership Bill. The Traditional and Khoisan Leadership Bill is currently before the President awaiting his signature. If the President were to sign that bill, it would repeal, so it would replace as law, the Traditional Leadership and Governance Framework Act. So the TLGFA would cease to operate as law and the TKLB would take its place. The TKLB is really, in essence, no better than the existing TLGFA. It carries with it some of the same problematic boundaries and adds an array of its own problems of its own. Ostensibly, the TKLB is sold as being about the recognition of Khoisan traditional leaders who do not and have not been included in the existing Traditional Leadership and Governance Framework Act. The very strong sentiment that I have, that my colleagues have, and that many of our activist colleagues have too, is that there's nothing wrong in trying to recognize Khoisan traditional leadership structures, but it's the manner in which this is being used to undermine and do severe damage to the ways of leadership that exist within African traditional communities. And so it's that element that really is the problematic component here, as opposed to this being about an objection to the recognition of Khoisan leadership. The real sort of problematic aspects of the TKLB that I'm going to hone in on, and I'm just going to pull out two. The first is that it too, like its predecessor, or at least the currently existing law, is that it also elicits the exercise of unaccountable power. So it does not in any way divert from the existing model of leadership that is fundamentally premised on state recognition, right? So like the Framework Act that currently exists, it too makes traditional leadership dependent upon state recognition. So it's the state that recognizes traditional leaders, and it's the state that pays their salary. So it continues that model, and it doesn't, on its own terms, facilitate the natural accountability mechanism that people like Governor Mbeki and Nelson Mandela were lamenting as having been deconstructed by the Bantu Authorities Act. So really it just continues that narrative and that legacy of an idea of traditional leadership that really removes traditional leaders from the heart of what it is that gives them their power and identity, which is the communities over which they exercise authority, or with which they exercise authority. The second element that I want to pull out around the TKLB is a particular clause in the bill. This is clause 24. Clause 24 of the TKLB is problematic in the following ways. It's problematic because it provides for traditional leaders to be able to enter into agreements on behalf of their communities with a range of actors. So it includes municipalities, but it also then includes the term other actors. And the question that we have, and the question that is answered in practice, is who are those other parties and who are those other actors? And of course the concern is that it would facilitate and open up the possibility for traditional leaders to enter into mining agreements with mining companies on behalf of their communities. Now, the bill requires that there be some consultation, but it does not necessarily require that there be consent. And in an environment where people's land rights are incredibly tenuous because there is as yet no permanent law designed to protect land rights held under customary law, you are eliciting the kind of situation where people could discover down the line that actually a traditional leader has agreed for mining to take place in their community, and nobody in the community is any the wiser. So it's incredibly problematic because it again opens up the potential for decisions to be taken about people's rights to land, their rights to access their graves, to access traditional medicines, a variety of rights that exist and that come with being part of a community are subjected to potentially being lost all on the whim of a traditional leader should they decide to enter into an agreement on behalf of their community. And again, at this point, the bill seems to give no sense that there is a way or a mechanism to check or balance this kind of power that is being assigned to traditional leaders. I'm going to move then very briefly to the Traditional Courts Bill. The Traditional Courts Bill, as I indicated at the beginning, is on its way through Parliament. We're awaiting its introduction to the National Council of Provinces. And as I said, this is the piece of law that would give traditional leaders the authority in law to establish and run their own courts. Now, in truth, we know that the courts are operating, and in part, the TCB seeks also to repeal an apartheid-era legislation, so it would repeal parts of the Black Administration Act. The problem is, again, the mechanism and the manner in which this authority is being given to traditional leaders. And so the key thing about the Traditional Courts Bill that I want to pull out, there are two, and they are as follows. The first is that those boundaries that I've been speaking about, right, the ones that have their rooting in the Bantu Authorities Act, are carried through into the Traditional Courts Bill. And what the version of the Traditional Courts Bill that is currently before Parliament does is that it does not give people the ability to opt out of appearing before a traditional court. The reason that this is problematic is because it means that South Africans, right, who are part of a unitary, single South Africa, are being subjected to a different legal system in comparison to those who live in areas that fall outside of those boundaries. So somebody who is resident in former homelands is being subjected to a law that forces them to go into a particular dispute resolution forum in a way that would not apply to somebody who lives in an urban center. This is incredibly problematic in instances where a traditional leader exercises their powers in ways that are quite abusive. And again, there are colleagues in the room who can speak to this with far more authority than I can. But if you live in a community where a traditional leader, for example, does not permit women to speak for themselves in front of a traditional court, you are deprived, on this current version of the bill, you are deprived of the option to not appear before that forum. You are required by this piece of law to appear, regardless as to whether or not you would prefer to take your dispute to a magistrate's court or to another forum. The other issue with the Traditional Courts Bill as it stands is, as I point out, it seems on paper to facilitate access for all people to traditional courts, but of course there are very real questions about what it actually means in terms of genuine access for women. And again, there are colleagues in the room who can speak to this with incredible authority and strength, but we know that rural women are a particularly kind of vulnerable group when it comes to the exercise of the powers of traditional leaders. And in the sense that the Traditional Courts Bill does not explicitly protect them against the kinds of abuses they are subjected to, it is highly problematic. I'm going to end there because I could keep going, but really the point that I want to emphasize is if this type of abuse, the types of experiences that you're going to hear about today are taking place in a context where they are not sanctioned by law, one can only imagine what will happen and how things will play out when these problematic pieces of law are passed. And this is at the heart of why the campaign is urging that the Bantustan Bills not be signed into law. Thank you.
So our next speaker will be looking at actions taken by rural communities against the bill. So I'd like to invite Constance Mokhale, who's the National Coordinator for the Alliance for Rural Democracy.